Standardized tests have been around for quite a long time now. Since 1901, these tests were the reasons that kids were sent to a higher level course of education. All year long, these kids study for this test, without them even knowing it really. And according to an article written by Scholastic, their results will show how well the teacher taught. Today, I'm going to be persuading you as to why standardized tests can negatively affect children. I am very much qualified to talk to you about this today because I've done quite a lot of extensive research. My 4 main points will discuss why standardized tests can negatively affect children, such as declining their mental health, and teachers only teaching for the test, the punishments that schools give to children because they don't pass the test, and the low self-esteem and motivation kids have from these tests. My first point today will be the negatives that can come from standardized tests and how they can dramatically affect a kid's mental health. Every year, kids dread the day that their teachers start talking about this test. And it's because these schools and teachers put so much pressure on these children to do well. Because if they don't, the school won't get a good rating. The school doesn't want that, do they? And according to a study given by the University of Texas, mental health in children, especially high schoolers, has rapidly declined. And with the ongoing pandemic we're in, kids who were online struggled and suffered even more than kids who weren't. That was the main reason why kids their mental health wasn't as great. And also, according to facts given by the Penn State News, these standardized tests are a main reason to why kids have anxiety these days. Now, you don't think that kids should have anxiety, but they do. And these tests are a big reason why. It's because, like I said before, teachers put so much pressure on these kids. Even schools do. They put so much pressure on these kids to do well because they won't get a good rating. And with all that pressure comes a lot of anxiety for children. My second point today will be why the negatives that can come from teachers only teaching for the test and not for the kids. I wouldn't be wrong if I said that teachers only taught for the test and they didn't teach anything about the curriculum. I mean, a lot of teachers do that. You may not notice it, but they do. When teachers do this, it can damage the education of children, which we don't want. We want kids to grow up and be smart and successful. For example, let me give you an example. Let's say a child goes through the school year. They learn everything they need to know about the test because their teacher thought it'd be a good idea to teach them for the test and not for the curriculum that they're given. And at the end of the year, the kid will pass this test, obviously, because they learned about it. But going into the next year, their new teacher starts talking about things and the kid doesn't understand. This is because the teacher didn't teach them that from last year. They only taught for the test. So this kid is going to go through every year for the rest of his life not knowing or understanding how to do this because he was never taught about it. Also, according to an article written by the Public School Review, pressure on teachers from these tests have gone up super high. It's a lot to handle, really, because these teachers are given so much pressure to teach these kids everything that they know about these tests. That way, they'll do well. If they do well, the school will get a good rating, and that's what the school wants. And this article also mentions how school districts really don't notice that teachers are struggling and how they're putting so much pressure on these teachers to do well. And it's also very frustrating because, like I mentioned before, the results that kids get on these tests reflect on how well the teacher was teaching. My third point will be how the negatives that can come from punishment that the schools give to children if they don't pass the test. We all know what happens when you don't pass your mandatory test that you have to take. You either get held back or you miss out on things. Most likely you get held back, which is not really a good thing, but it helps you. According to a survey given by the National Education Association, 64% of people in America believed that these standardized tests put too much pressure on kids and that they shouldn't be a thing in general. But on the other hand, the other 17% believe that these tests are good for the children and that they should keep going. Honestly, these tests put so much pressure that it's a lot to handle. And it's also funny because even if you don't pass it, there are many subjects that these tests have that aren't mandatory, which shouldn't matter. If you don't pass it, you don't pass it. If you don't pass it, you shouldn't be held back for that. Like I mentioned before, kids spend all year studying for this test, and their mental health will decrease with it, like everyone else does. And they have all this pressure to do well and do everything right, because, well, it reflects on how well they learned and how well their teacher taught. And they know that they can face consequences if they don't do well, and kids don't want that. Then they know that if they get held back, they won't be with their friends anymore. And mostly everybody knows that children love friends, and you don't want to do that to a child. My fourth and final point would be why tests can lower the self-esteem and motivation of children. Because of these tests, children have such a low self-esteem and they won't have any motivation. This is because, well, like I've mentioned a lot of times already, there's a lot of pressure going on. And these children have all this pressure and to do well, and eventually it gets where it's too much to handle and their self-esteem will go down. They'll start thinking that they're not good enough, and then eventually they won't pass the test and they'll be held back. Then after that, they'll start thinking worse and worse of themselves, like they're not good enough, and it gets really bad after that. And this is the main reason why kids don't do well on these tests. Now, I presented you with concrete background of the negatives, such as a decline in children's mental health, teachers only teaching for the test, and the punishment that schools give to you, and the self-esteem and low motivation that kids have. Today, I persuaded you why these standardized tests can be very harmful to children. Now, do you believe these tests should be gone in sake of the children?